Well, I'm delighted to round off the session this morning. I'm speaking about a project that's very much in its inception, but it's based around a site which, of course, everyone knows or has heard of, and I'm slightly daunted by the fact that an awful lot of people in this room have written about it and have their own particular feelings about it. So I hope I get everyone's opinion in here, and if I don't, I'm sure you can come and find me later on and correct me. First of all, to say that obviously this is with my colleague, Dr. David Petts, and a postdoctoral researcher at Durham University, Brian Buchanan, who can't be here today. So this is a collaborative project, and we're also working with the Yevering Trust, who manages the site, or at least part of the site, in Northumberland. Okay, so Yevering is an iconic name. It's a site situated in the county of Northumberland, right up in the northern part, I suppose, of England as we conceive it, but right on the Scottish border. So it has an ambiguous geographic position. And of course, it's very well known through the words of Bede. It's one of those sites that is mentioned, albeit very briefly, by Bede in 731, who talks about it as a royal residence, a place where Edwin, the king and queen, visited for a period of time, quite an extensive period of time, accompanied in this case by Paulinus, a missionary, who actually used that place, or that gathering place, as a location purportedly to bring people together to baptise them and convert them to the Christian faith. And another key element of that very brief mention or section in Bede is that he talks about the residence of Yevering being abandoned, and the seat of royal power, the later kings moving their power to Mailman, or Milfield as we know it, which is a neighbouring site located very close by. I won't be saying a lot about Milfield today because I know it will come up in the presentations tomorrow. So just to give you an indication of where we are, we've seen a lot of the southern sites, and we've seen some very rich material archaeology. What I'm going to show you now about Yevering is we may be rich in structures, but we have a site that's very poor in material terms. I'm going to talk, obviously, today about Hope Taylor's excavations in brief, some of the later work on the site by Anthony Harding, and then come in and discuss some of the things we've been doing on our project, which is really about situating the palace complex, the royal complex, in its hinterland, trying to understand it in the broader landscape and in relation to a broader range of early medieval material evidence, but also evidence from the Iron Age and Romano-British periods. Okay, so Yevering was discovered by aerial photography in the early part of the 20th century. This is a much later photograph, but it's one that really picks out the full extent of the site. And as we'll see, Hope Taylor, in fact, only concentrated his excavations to the north of the site. Sorry, I've lost the... Is it that one?
No.
Okay.
And the red.
The red. Sorry, excuse me. He concentrated his excavations to the north of the road. This aerial photograph picks out a number of important aspects which have already appeared in several of the papers so far. The first being that although the focus has been on the early medieval complex, this is a multi-period site. This is a site that has monumental evidence reaching back from the Neolithic through into the Bronze Age. And of course it's a site which is dominated, as we'll see in a second, by a hill fort overlooking this gravel plateau or plain. Before we actually reach the 5th, 6th, 7th century, we see early medieval evidence on the site. But just to get people orientated, this is the great enclosure. Some very ambiguously dated. As we'll see, the chronology, is very hazy and has been, various people have tried to tighten it up. The great enclosure was thought by Hope Taylor to be potentially 5th century, 6th century, 4th, 5th, 6th century in its inception. Here we can see the main hall complex, which develops over a period of time, certainly through 4+ phases, and you might be able to pick out a number of the other structures and the western complex over here. But crucially, we can also see some of the prehistory, henge and Bronze Age barrows on the site, which are important in the fact they appear to structure evidence, as we've seen before at other locations. The orientation and location of the buildings are both aligned on those structures, and during the period of development of the site, those alignments seem to be quite important. Those relationships remain important. Okay, so very brief sort of background to investigation on the site. Hope Taylor was working in the 50s and 60s. as I said, to the north of the road. And later on in the 1970s, Anthony Harding undertook some excavation to the south of the road to look at some of the prehistoric features on the site. And we'll have a little bit of a look at that in a second. We've been working with the Hope Taylor archive, which we won't go into in detail, but there's some fantastic images coming through from those original 50s and 60s excavations of some of the structures actually in the process of being excavated and dug. What we can see here, I suppose, is the main area, the plateau itself. So this is a free-draining gravel plateau above a river confluence or valley above the Don and the Till and Tweed, above the Glen and the Till and Tweed. So it's situated in a prominent and visible place, but in the shadow of a very dominant and imposing earlier feature, which is, of course, Yevering Bell. So the name of Yevering, I know I'm telling everyone things they know here potentially, but it features in Bede, and of course it's related to the Hill of the Goat, so it has a relationship people have talked about to a sort of iconic name or value relating perhaps to a tribal territory. What we know about the hill fort is it's active through into the 1st century AD, but much work has debated whether there is later activity on this hill fort site. And at the moment the conclusion is that it's limited, that there is Roman material from excavations within the ramparts, but very small amounts of material, coinage, small amounts of ceramic. So the general feeling is that this is an imposing hill fort settlement that goes out of use. But it remains an iconic focus, perhaps leading then to the relationship between the palace site and the landscape later on. Okay, so just thinking about the complex itself and what we know. And we'll talk in more detail about chronology in a second. The Great Enclosure is thought to be one of the earliest aspects of the site. But if we look at the prehistoric features, the sort of small ring ditch or possible henge where the stones had been removed, and a Bronze Age ring ditch, probably a barrow, over here on the eastern side. These are kind of structuring elements that seem to lead to both prehistoric activity and then activity, I suppose, of the Iron Age Romano-British period. And our whole complex and settlement then develops in relation to this. And a great deal has been talked about in terms of the chronology, but just to point out, this is not just a settlement, but a settlement that has cemeteries, again, in association with it. It has 2 foci of burial, one over here to the west and one to the east, with the west being thought to be the earliest developing cemetery. Now, Hope Taylor considered this, he considered his chronology to be dictated by the written documentation, historical sources which talk about the expansion of the kingdoms of Bernicia and Northumbria at the expense of the British kingdoms. And also that gave him a kind of a chronological frame in which to situate what he saw as 2 evidence of 2 periods of destruction on the site. So this is Hope Taylor's kind of long sequence. It was also based on the idea of some of the earlier buildings in that first phase on the top left being of a British type of structure. However, Chris Scull, Roger Micott, a number of other people have come in and redefined that chronology and very much argued that there's no issue in seeing this as a kind of 6th century site, a site that developed in the mid-6th century and develops. And that's quite interesting from the point of view of the lifespan of the site. We've been hearing a lot about the idea of enduring locales and continuity over time. But actually, we think about this as a mid-6th, 7th century site, leading up perhaps, as Sam Lucy has argued, to burial that could survive into the 8th century. We're looking at a very tight chronological frame, in fact, for the development of these buildings and the complex. And somebody else was making the point today about, I think it's Helena, about the idea of the rapidity and change on some sites in creation, the replacement and repair of buildings. And of course, we see a number of phases, which you can see here, the development of the complex, the arrival of sort of structure E, the amphi or the auditorium, which we'll look at in a second, the arrival of the more evolved hall complex and its development over time. So there's a kind of rapid expansion and replacement of buildings, but in what seems to be a relatively short time frame. Okay, now as I said, we are very, very poor in terms of finds, having looked at Rendlesham earlier on, but we are rich in terms of our structural evidence. I don't necessarily have time today to go into an enormous amount of depth about every aspect of the complex, but these are the things I wanted to pick out and remind people of. First of all, our sort of Western complex, or Area D, where Hope Taylor had argued there was a cultic focus, a series of buildings where there's animal bone, ox skulls, and also this structure which was encased twice during the course of its life. And our debate has sort of continued about what the activities were within that Western complex. But we have burial, we have burial aligned on sort of standing posts and foci, and we do seem to have, I suppose, as Sam Lucy has argued, a pre-Christian phase of burial on that side of the site. We also, of course, have the main hall complex, which you can see under excavation here in the slide below. And I've put this image in because this is the single example we have of a sunken feature building from the site. But the excavations here the photograph here shows it really in its full detail, which I hadn't seen before until we returned to the archive. So it's giving quite sort of detailed insight into the fact of what this looked like, the surviving timbers, and of course from our point of view of the project, making us think about the possibilities of revisiting and redating some of these deposits if they're still in situ. Another crucial structure on the site is the structure E, or building E, the auditorium, which if we just come back to the main plan of Hope Taylor's excavations, we can see situated sort of right at the heart of the complex. If we look at the sequence of development, something I find quite interesting, even if we concentrate that sequence, is that structure E seems to arrive around about the same time as the Western complex and appears in relationship to the growth of the major palace complex. So we're looking at quite an interesting array of sort of formal design of buildings, developments of large imposing structures, and the creation of a structure that's devoted to the purposes of gathering or assembly or public speaking. And that seems, or many people have thought, fits very nicely into the idea of this as a site of royal visitation, into Bede's words about this being a place of gathering, a place of conversion, a place of baptism, and sort of raises all sorts of nice and interesting questions about the temporary nature of these sites as places of periodic visitation, periodic gathering, and what purpose they might serve perhaps as tribute centres or places for bringing people together and to enact power. Sam Lucy's talked quite extensively. She revisited the cemeteries and looked at the chronology in detail in 2005. As I said, there are two areas of burial within the site. The western area begins with a series of burials in a radial alignment around a feature that seems to be prehistoric and develops into a smaller cemetery. We then get the eastern cemetery, which is around the Bronze Age ring ditch within the Great Enclosure, and this is much more extensive, reaching up to about 360 burials, which are well aligned. Our problem is they're very poorly furnished, and the soil conditions on this site, I mean, the material richness is very limited. So we only have a number of burials that have any furnishings at all, and in fact Sam Lucy's argued it's really a feature of this burial sequence that these are unfurnished burials and actually perhaps fit into the kinds of traditions we see a little further north in the Lothians. So you might think of this as being a typically hybrid type of cemetery evidence that fits the positioning of Yevering, its place and situation in relation to sort of political fluctuation and fluctuations in identity. Of course, there are these quite interesting phenomena. So the Western Cemetery seems to develop from the focus of grave AX, which is a very famous kind of watcher at the threshold of the great hall structure. You can see just on the right-hand side, and you can see there that kind of shadowy body, which is really the limit of the evidence we have, which really shadow shapes rather than any bone or physical remains that we could return to and do more, perhaps more high-resolution dating or isotopic study. Okay, and here are some of the very, very limited finds from the site. We really do have literally, half a garage full of boxes and no more. It's a very sort of minimal range of material. There was a significant amount of zooarchaeological remains of animal bone and ox skulls, cattle bone, which has since been lost from the excavations. But what we do have is surviving ceramics. I've put these up because this is one of the kind of contentious elements about the excavations by Hope Taylor, his whole dialogue about the British and Anglo-Saxon control and identity. And subsequently, some of this ceramic has been debated, but he very much saw it as a native pottery, that this was a settlement where people were, native communities were sort of, I think he describes it as being weak in the face of the kind of robust Venetian Anglo-Saxon power, and that gives you a kind of understanding perhaps of the interpretive framework he was working with. I have to say, having seen this, I'm fairly dubious about it. I'd love the prehistorians in the audience maybe to comment, but I do wonder whether some of this material has kind of been fitted into that historical framework, the way in which the sequence initially was by Hope Taylor as well. Anthony Harding visited the site really with his interest in some of the prehistoric monuments. So now we're in the south of the road, in an area that's seen much more limited excavation, and we're looking at a henge complex, a small henge, which has been excavated but turned up early medieval evidence. So very excitingly here we can see a number of pits and post holes. They don't necessarily make a structure, or there is something that seems to be structured there. But the key thing is that a number of crucible fragments are found, around 13 crucible fragments, evidence of copper alloy smelting and production. So there is kind of high status, or there is metalworking evidence from this site, much as the way we've seen from other sites today. This also shows us, on the slide to the left, that the settlement extends further, that Yevering's not merely concentrated on Hope Taylor's excavations. We have a series of rectangular structures, you can see there, or hall-type buildings stretching out from the complex, which fit very much with the alignment of the main complex itself, and they remain unexcavated and undated, but tell us at least the core is greater for this early medieval settlement, and there is productive evidence on the site that's broadly aligned perhaps with the height of the settlement in the 7th century. Okay, so really onto our project and where we come in. It's difficult to work with such a massive, iconic report, and which has left its mark on early medieval archaeology. But the thing that we've been very interested in, excited about, is trying to understand Yevering in its broader landscape context, because of course it's not on its own. It's a site, one of several sites within the Milfield basin, which have been shown through excavation and some more documentary evidence to be active within this 6th, 7th, 8th century framework. I'm talking here really about the work by Clive Waddington and Tim Gates on the Milfield Basin project, where they have, through gravel quarry work, identified a series of 6th century sites. And they're quite poor and scrappy and damaged, but nevertheless they do begin to show us a developmental sequence around these river confluences of settlements that are situated on the gravel terraces just above the floodplain. So like Yevering, all of these sites kind of share a position not on the slopes of the upland and not right down near to the watercourses, but on a distinct geology that frames the entire water system that you can see there. So you see Yevering in the front of the picture, overshadowed by Yevering Bell, Lantern Quarry, Chivik Quarry, and Milfield, of course, which has seen excavation, only limited excavation, and that revealed a cemetery, at least, that put some of the burial evidence in the 7th century, although, of course, Bede suggests or makes the assertion that when Yevering reaches the end of its lifespan, the royal site had moved already by 731 to Milfield. In addition to this, we also have a series of more enigmatic sites, which clearly from aerial photographs of sunken featured buildings, which again, only one has been excavated, but these two are scattered through those river valleys. So there's something quite interesting here about using or piecing together this fragmentary evidence to try and understand the 6th, 7th, 8th century community that's related to and living around the watercourses, the floodplain, and the uplands of the Milfield Basin. Okay, so if we were to characterise that landscape, something that I think is essential in order to contextualise that information is thinking about the Cheviot Hills. The upland, as Susan Oosthuizen has argued, has probably remained unchanged since the late Iron Age through to the 18th century in terms of being upland, high quality, open grassland. And that in itself has kind of informed the land use, the agricultural processes, the transhumance processes of communities in relation to this landscape. So we have to imagine this as a major confluence, really, river valleys and floodplains of fertile land, dominated and overlooked by this very fertile grass upland resource, which of course makes it ideal for transhumance and upland exploitation, which is an idea that's very much informed what we understand for settlement in the late Iron Age and Romano-British period. So if we just take a look at that, I'm sorry this is dots on maps, but if we place our early medieval evidence broadly in relation to the yellow, which is our sort of RB or late Iron Age RB evidence, sorry, the blue and the yellow is conflated, that's the Iron Age through to Roman evidence in this landscape, and the green is the early medieval. You can begin to see there is a distinct disparity in evidence for activity, but of course there are biases. We get a lot of upland survival of earthworks, which in turn sort of leads to an increased number of identification of Romano-British Iron Age type complexes. However, there's quite an interesting range of evidence there showing that in the late Roman Iron Age there was an exploitation of those upland zones, and particularly areas that are just above on the escarpment, above the floodplain, which are really the routeways leading up onto that upland pasture. And this is sort of underpinned really by George Dobie's work, who looked at something called scoop settlements in the Milfield basin. These are these kind of spectacle-like features which you can see on the right-hand side of the yellow arrow. They're not particularly well dated, but they're certainly thought to be active in the late Iron Age Roman period when they've been excavated. But they are thought to be connected, or rather like sheelings, to the idea of transhumance and upland movement of animals and seasonal or temporary settlement. So if we were to place Yevering in the context of those, it begins to look quite interesting if we think about more long-term patterns of land use in the period, sort of leading through from this late Iron Age, Roman, and into the early medieval period. And at least one of these sites has a sort of rectangular structure which is thought to be a medieval shieling in association with it, kind of hinting that there is continuity of some of these places through into, say, the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And what we're missing perhaps is putting these into the picture for understanding our early medieval populated and occupied landscape. So taking that a little bit further and thinking about Yevering in terms of sort of long-distance land use, river valleys. What we're looking on the left there is an omnidirectional surface map, which is very kindly generated for me by Stuart Brooks on the Travel project at UCL. And it just gives you one very clear and important message, which is that Yevering, that red dot, is situated on one of the big main thoroughfares, if you like, from the upland through to the lowland. And you can pick out there, I guess, the kind of Milfield basin and the confluence of river courses. And the idea perhaps that if you were using the upland for managing animal resources, you may well be funneling stock down at different points of the year into this big river valley. So if you tie that together perhaps and think about the animal bone from Yevering, the corral at Yevering, which is thought to be related to managing cattle, though people argued for other possibilities, and this idea of grazing herds on the upland and upland lowland economies, it starts to look really quite exciting, I suppose, and gives us another added dimension to how this palace site might be situated in relation to longer term patterns of practice. So very briefly, we've also been dipping into the LiDAR data, and we've been working with Stuart Ainsworth, Tim Gates and Al Oswald in terms of ground truthing some of that LiDAR data. I'm just going to show you two things at the moment. One's ambiguous and one less so. But this is the Yevering Bell on the left-hand side. This is our plateau where the palace complex is situated. We've begun to pick out a number of features that are possibly the rig and furrows superimposed on the top, but a series, this at least looks like two earlier parallel features that run or clip the plateau and run down to, of course, the kind of confluence or fording place of the River Glen below the site. I have to say that's pretty ambiguous, and we're still doing work in terms of looking at the kind of ground truthing out on the ground and looking at the rig and furrow and the superimposition of remains. this is much less so. This is to the southeast of the Bell. This is a whole series of new features that have come up through the Lidl, which is basically allowing us to see what's below the bracken. And here we've got a whole series of enclosures and features which initially we thought were very definitely late Iron Age, Romano-British period. So again, kind of corroborating the work that these guys have done on some of the other hill forts, showing that there is a continuity of activity in the landscape and not directly on sites. Different things are happening within these more extended landscapes over time, and slope settlement and downslope settlement is something that we're seeing after the kind of height of the occupation of the hill forts. But if we take a look at that a little more closely, what is exciting but is entirely unexplored is they've also picked out several rectilinear structures, rather like the one I was talking about, that might be shealing sites. They might be medieval in date, undated at present, but there are several kind of clusters of them in association with these late Iron Age RB earthworks and earthwork features. They've also picked up some fantastic things like Bronze Age cairn cemeteries and other enclosures and settlement activity as well. But I suppose from our point as early medievalists, this is beginning perhaps to give us more of an understanding again about that very special complex being only one small element of a much bigger populated active landscape that's engaging with different upland, lowland, watercourse resources, and perhaps therefore leads us to think, you know, about this issue of the temporary nature of these sites, which I've put in because I know several people have been debating it. I've talked in the past particularly about the relationship of prehistoric monuments to be about constructing kind of enduring ties with the past. But it's very clear that some places we've seen today are short-lived, or at least one phase. Yevering isn't one phase, but it's quite concentrated in terms of activity. I suppose what's interesting for me is it becomes highly visible as one centre with a kind of shadowy backdrop of other possible places of activity in these river systems. But it becomes very, very materially visible for a relatively short space of time. And I'm not the first, or we're not the first by any means, to talk about it as a place of gathering tribute or royal exploitation. But perhaps this kind of landscape backdrop that we're beginning to put together does begin to hone that argument and make you think about it really as a signal of elite involvement in a more collective politics of resource management, so elite engagement for a period of time with a much wider and populous landscape. Okay, thank you.